Okay, good afternoon. Should begin. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability for support of the seminar series. So today is my great pleasure to introduce Ruth DeFries. Ruth is a professor of ecology and sustainable development at Columbia University. We tried to get Ruth here a few years ago, but we couldn't make the schedules work out. Luckily this year with Zoom, it works out perfectly. This week's Ruth's virtual visit to Cornell is made possible by the Barbara McClintock Life Sciences Lecture Series, where she's given an additional talk on Thursday at 4 p.m. It's entitled Nature's Secrets for Navigating Uncertain Times. And you can find out more about this talk by looking for Life Sciences lecturers at Cornell. So Ruth has pioneered work using images from satellites and field surveys to examine the world's demands for food and other resources and how they're changing land use throughout the tropics. Her research quantifies how these land use changes affect climate, biodiversity, other ecosystem services, as well as human development. So Ruth has been elected a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and received the MacArthur Genius Award. She's committed to communicating the nuances and complexities of sustainable development to popular audiences through her books. The Big Ratchet, How Humanity Thrives in the Face of Natural Crisis, and a book that was just published in, I think it was December 2020, What Would Nature Do? A Guide for Uncertain Times. So welcome, Ruth, and thank you for coming to speak to us.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I wish we were in person, but this will have to do. And before I get started, I'll say that the Thursday lecture will be very, very different from today. The Thursday lecture will be sort of abstract ideas about what we can learn from nature for our guiding our civilization in the Anthropocene. Today, very different. Today, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to dig in to a place that means a lot to me. I certainly don't expect it to mean a lot to you, but to think about what climate from a mitigation point of view and an adaptation point of view, what it means when you get on the ground in difficult, important conservation areas like this area in the heart of India, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So I've seen you've had a lot of interesting seminars in this series already. I think this is going to be a little different because it's going to be very place-based and very much thinking about how we take all of the important ideas about climate mitigation and adaptation and what it might mean when we actually get to the ground. Can you see? You can see okay?
Yeah, we can. It looks good. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm sure that you all realize by now that climate is a really, really complex, wicked problem. And by wicked problems, I mean that there is not a clear solution. Everyone has a different idea about what the solutions might be, or even what the problem is. The idea of wicked problems came out of urban planning in the 1970s, because urban planning is also a wicked problem. It seems like climate should be a really easy problem. Just stop burning fossil fuels. But it is not quite that simple, because the entire world's economy runs off of fossil fuels. Energy alternatives all have their own trade-offs. We know that there's greenhouse gases in the atmosphere enough that we really have to think about how societies can adapt to climate change. Lots of vulnerabilities. Really, really hard problem. So if somebody tells you that they have the solution or the silver bullet to climate change, well, I'd suggest that you ask a lot of questions, because it's a really, probably one of the hardest questions that humanity has ever faced. So what I'm going to do is zoom in to a particular landscape, which is right at the heart of India, and talk about 3 mini stories that relate to climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And these little stories are based on research that that my students have done, postdocs have done, really zooming in to this landscape and trying to understand what can make this a more sustainable landscape. And the point of all of this is what I have realized, starting out working at a very sort of global scale, getting down to the ground, in that any solution or any way forward that we can think about with climate mitigation and climate adaptation really starts with people on the ground, livelihoods, health, resilience, what people need. And that's the way. And if that is overlapping with climate mitigation, then we have a pathway. But it starts with thinking about people on the ground. So I have 3 little stories about that. But before getting to these stories, I want to orient you to the landscape. So I'm going to do that and then tell a little story, and then we can stop and have some questions and then go through the stories one by one. So this is a landscape which is right at the heart of India, right in the middle of India. And it is an area of, I got there, I started working there because it's a fascinating area. It's one of the remaining forested areas of the country, and it's a globally important from the point of view of tiger conservation. But I've learned so much more about this landscape, and that is related to the people. So the people in this landscape, many different tribal groups and ethnicities, and this is where there are a lot of people who are dependent on forests for basic needs, for collecting wood to cook, to graze cattle, to get some income out of non-timber forest products. These are very poor populations and very dependent on forests, and forest dependent people are among the poorest in the world. So there's a lot of development challenges in this landscape. There's also a lot of food insecurity. This is work from one of my PhD students a couple of years ago to survey households and identify the degree of food insecurity. So we understand that there is not extreme hunger, but a lot of households in these forest dependent communities who are food insecure, and the households that are least food insecure are those that have stable jobs. So this is sort of income related, not particularly, lack of access to forest foods or what you might imagine. This is a kind of a market connected landscape, but lots of poverty and food insecurity. We also know from surveys that we've done of 5,000 households that they're about 20% or 18% of those households use seasonal migration, that is sending one of their household members to urban areas to work in labor, construction, security guards, those sorts of low skill jobs, to send remittances and earn some income for the household. And those are the poorest households who are using that livelihood strategy. This is not a landscape where people are emptying, like you think about if you've studied the forest transition, where people leave the landscape and the forest rebounds. That's not what's going on here at this time. This is seasonal migration, where the households stay in the landscape and then one member will go to the city. And this is related to one of the stories later on. Just to put a human face on it, this is a gentleman who was telling us that 2 of his sons were working in the city, and that really changes the family dynamics and the labor available for agriculture. And he was telling us his story. You can see the beautiful houses. On the other side, on the conservation side, there we go. On the conservation side, This is a globally important tiger conservation area. So most of the world's remaining tigers are in India, and this landscape has 30% of the tigers in the country. Lots of other important species as well, and there are these very relatively well-funded and well-managed tiger reserves and network of parks, but they are extremely, extremely small, and tigers and other large mammals need more space to disperse and to maintain their genetic health. So there is still functional movement of tigers and others between these protected areas, which is another part of the story, because there are a lot of development pressures in this landscape, which is severing these the connectivity between these protected areas through expansion of highways, rail, mines, energy infrastructure, all kinds of development pressures, which is important for development, but has the worrisome impact of threatening the connectivity that these important tigers and other large mammals need to move and maintain the health of their populations. So that's one big force in the landscape. And finally, there is quite a bit of degraded forests, which comes along with that heavy dependence. You can see here some invasive species and some places that have been, trampled by cattle, and trees being cut down for construction. And there's just a lot of pressure on these forests and very obvious degradation on the ground. So that's this kind of the situation on the ground. When we think about climate mitigation, the latest kind of shiny object in climate mitigation, which you've probably been hearing about, is the idea of nature-based solutions. That if we, global community, somehow can plant a bunch of trees that sequester carbon, then that would be one way forward with climate mitigation. Now, if you've read Bill Gates' recent book, he's not such a fan of this approach, and I agree with him on many respects, because there's all kinds of really hard issues when you get to the ground and move away from these nice looking, beautiful, GIS layers and maps and these studies which have identified the global restoration potential. When you get to the ground, things get a whole lot more complicated. There's conflicting tenure rights. There's conflicts with livelihoods, people who use the land for agriculture and grow food. There's also the tendency of governments to think about restoration as planting monoculture trees, eucalyptus or some kind of single species, and that's really not, from an ecological point of view, what we would have in mind for restoring forests, although it does certainly sequester carbon. So when you go from these sort of big maps of nature-based solutions and thinking about the restoration potential to how that could actually play out on the ground, things get a lot trickier. So the first mini story I want to tell you about is some research to sort of flip that idea around. So this is a very, as I said, a very, lots of poverty in this landscape, lots of forest dependence, and lots of government schemes to try to alleviate poverty. So there has been a scheme since 2016, which has focused on, it's called the Ujjwala scheme, that has focused on pushing out liquefied petroleum gas, so cooking gas, LPG, which would replace fuel wood. So there's a lot of good reasons for that. for public health. Indoor air pollution from cooking over biomass is a major public health problem. So there's lots of good reasons. And one of my students looked into the question of how successful has that program been in this landscape, which is, pretty remote. And there has been quite a bit of penetration of LPG into this landscape. You can see here on the left of those blue dots are the households, that the villages where we surveyed households, 500 of them. And on the right is the year that they adopted LPG. So there has been some uptake, although still quite a lot of households who also depend on fuel wood because they don't just give up fuel wood. Also, there is something very noticeable in the landscape is people, if they get the financial resources or access to some government scheme, to convert these mud houses into concrete houses. And while it just pains me because these houses are just so incredibly beautiful, I step back from my romantic idea about how beautiful these houses are and realize that it is really hard to maintain these. They have to be repaired every year. They leak during the monsoon. They're insects. So I certainly understand why people want more durable housing. And in particular, they require repair, which requires, and most people get those logs to repair their houses. There are logs under the roof here, under the tiled roof, that require depending on the forest. So one effort that we've had in our research in this landscape is to try to map out this forest degradation, those pictures that I showed you before. And this is a really kind of a challenging question. We're previously on mapping deforestation, and that is just, is the tree there and is it not there? Forest degradation is a much more difficult kind of, even to define what is forest degradation. There are many different ways about thinking about whether a forest is degraded or not, functional, structural. And the way we went about it was to try to map with high resolution planet data, 3-meter resolution, the bare ground within forests. So those patches, like in those pictures I showed you previously, those patches where there's a lot of bare ground as an indicator of degradation. So here. So I know this won't mean a lot to you if you're not used to looking at satellite imagery, but this is my student, Sarika, who's, I spelled her name wrong, apologies to Sarika, who has been working on this index of degradation and zooming in to map out this bare ground index, this exposed ground based on this planet classification. And the upshot of it is that we see degradation around the edges of forests, as you could expect, around villages, which you would expect because people depend on forests, and it seems to be picking up a measure of human use and degradation. So then the question is, we know that people have been increasingly adopting LPG, so using less, potentially using less fuel wood, and more people are shifting to durable housing, although it's still a minority in the landscape. So the question that we ask is those improvements of living standards, which are not really aimed to reduce forest degradation, they're aimed to alleviate multidimensional poverty. And one aspect of that is improving living standards. But do those improvements in living standards, alternatives to cooking fuels and durable housing, is that, can we have a kind of a causal relationship between those improved living standards and forest degradation? And using this very wonderful method that I've just become familiar with, causal forests, a machine learning method to test treatment effects, we do see an effect most strongly near villages. So this is the treatment effect of alternative energy for cooking or of durable house material on this bare ground index, this index of degradation in the 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, 5 kilometer buffers around these 500 villages. And in fact, we do see less degradation where there is more households that have alternatives to fuel wood and have durable housing. So that says to me that it is thinking from a people point of view, what people need, poverty alleviation, and how to approach the problem of forest dependence from that perspective, rather than trying to keep people out of the forest, making all of these rules about who can go where and who can carry out how many headloads of fuel wood, to think about this issue of forest dependence from the point of view of what people need and reduce pressure on forests that way. So the point from this first little story is that interventions for improved livelihoods for the purpose of poverty alleviation can contribute to climate mitigation through forest restoration without all the land use conflicts and the restricting rights to use forests, because it is better for people. And how to match that kind of bottom-up thinking with these top-down maps of forest restoration potential, I think is something we want to think about. Otherwise, that restoration potential will just remain potential on a map and not get realized on the ground. So that's my first little story. So we can stop there and have a little bit of back and forth and then move on to the next one.
Okay, so there's a question here from Sai. Sai, could you explain more why cooking gas is a better solution than firewood?
Yeah. So the LPG, it's a canister, like a propane, like when you go camping and you have a propane stove, that's a canister and stove. That's exactly what it is. It is better from the point of view, definitely better from the point of view of indoor air quality, because the black carbon and the pollutants that come off of burning fuel wood, and women and children in particular breathing that, is a huge public health problem. So that's one thing. Second is the time spent collecting fuel wood and the pressure on the forest. So there was another study that we did, which was in a different part of the country, in the southern state of Karnataka, where there was a alternative cooking fuel. And the result of that was that households had better nutrition. They had more diverse diets. Kids ate breakfast more often. Don't have to, like, you can just turn on the gas like we do in our houses, rather than build up a stove. So kids were eating breakfast more, and altogether more diverse diets, and women spent less time. They had more free time. So there are some benefits. There are also some disbenefits, and that is it costs. People have to buy the canisters. There's some government schemes to help with that, but they have to, it's not free like fuel wood. And it's also, from a national point of view, dependence on imports of that LPG. So like everything else, there's pluses and minuses.
So question from Connor, what's the main inhibitor of an oil gas transition from wood? If there's a 100% adoption rate, would there be any supply chain issue leading to households returning to wood burning?
Yeah, so I think the main inhibition, the biggest issue is that once the first free canister of LPG runs out, then people have to pay for it. And that's hard to do when you're used to getting your resource for free. So I totally understand that. Plus, people don't really completely give up the fuel wood. They'll use both. It's what's called fuel stacking. They'll use the LPG for cooking some kinds of food or making tea or bringing it out when there's a guest or something like that, and then continue to use fuel wood for some kind of cooking. So it's not really an either or. If your question, if 100% depended on LPG, as I said, it's imported into the country, so it's subject to price fluctuations. And but there has been a really big push to increase adoption of LPG, and it's been very successful. And this is one of the sort of the more remote regions of the country where there's been less adoption, but elsewhere there's been a lot of adoption. I don't know if that answers your question, Connor.
Question from Stephen Wolf. Is the idea that the mapping of forest restoration potential would be used for geographic targeting efforts to make LPG available to local people? If yes, which actors would use these maps, and what are the criteria for prioritizing an area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we didn't try to map forest degradation for that reason. The reason we mapped forest degradation was because we were trying to understand whether the migration it reduces forest degradation through changing the pressures on the forest. That's the reason that we did it. But we could also think about using to target. Yeah, I think we'd want to target populations from the point of view of poverty alleviation, and in addition to forest degradation, so where people could benefit the most from it. And also now we can think about, if this method works to map forest degradation, we can track over time and understand how forest degradation is increasing, decreasing, how it relates to conservation objectives, and all kinds of other questions.
Okay, maybe we should take one more question now, and then we can take more at the end. So there's a question from Emily. I was wondering, where does the funding come to pay for the housing improvements?
Yes, so that's a government scheme. So in India, there are all kinds of government schemes which are aimed at various objectives, like durable housing. So I believe that scheme provides loans and good terms for people to be able to make housing. Also, if people come into, I've seen this a lot, if people come into some income from maybe from remittances or from good sales of their crops, or for some, the income of the household increases, then pretty much the first thing they do is make a concrete house, which I say, it's like, oh, it pains me, because the mud houses are so beautiful and the concrete houses are ugly and hot, really hot. But I completely understand, and it's certainly not my place to say what people should want to do.
So maybe we should move on to your next story, and then we can take some more questions at the end, or after your next story, I guess.
All right. Oops, sorry. Okay, here we go. So the next one is about climate resilience, and what we've learned about possibilities to identify strategies which improve nutrition. As we said before, there's a lot of food insecurity and micronutrient deficiencies in this landscape. So improve nutrition and achieve some climate resilience. And as you can see from this map, South Asia is really in the bullseye for at risk for climate change. And you could see here, this is a map that I took from this publication, which mapped the risks for different locations in terms of water stress, energy stress, related to multiple models, and also the density of the vulnerable populations. And what you see at 1.5 degrees and then at 3 degrees, popping out even more, that South Asia is just really in the bullseye there. So how to think about climate resilience, and 70% of the population in India is rural, and most of that population depends on agriculture. So there's a lot of thinking to be done, or an action to be done to make these households resilient, or systems in general resilient to climate change. So this is on the backdrop of what has been going on for the past decades, going back to the 1960s, the Green Revolution, which was the international effort to improve yields and production of, primarily started with wheat and then rice in developing countries around the world. And India was a big focus for the Green Revolution. And like everything else, there's goods and there's bads. It's amazing achievement that cereal production has increased, kept pace with population growth, which has been a lot. And there are not the kinds of famines that were prevalent before the Green Revolution. So I am not one of these people who goes around saying that the Green Revolution was the worst idea that ever happened. I don't think that at all, but I do think it could have had some mid-course corrections. So one of the issues of the Green Revolution was that the research focus and the dissemination and extension was all about increasing the production of rice with high yielding varieties and wheat, which requires irrigation in the winter season. So as you can see from this graphic here, the production of rice and wheat increased amazingly. And those are follow the C3 photosynthetic pathway. There are also a number, hundreds, thousands of different varieties of different kinds of millets and of maize. Those are C4, follow the C4 photosynthetic pathway, which did not receive the same kind of attention, these traditional cereals. So you can see here that as a proportion of the overall cereal production, they drastically declined. So is that a bad thing? Well, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. It's not a bad thing because overall production increased, but there are some really substantial differences between the C3 and the C4 cereals, particularly with rice, which is a mainstay of the diet. So the C4 traditional cereals are more climate resilient because they're adapted to dry conditions. That's where C4, the photosynthetic pathway, developed, was to make plants more resilient to drought. And they are also higher than rice in particular of important micronutrients such as iron and zinc. And iron deficiency anemia is a big problem in this landscape and in general in many places, and in India. So these C3 cereals became more prominent in the production systems, and so consequently in diets, than the C4 traditional cereals. So then what happened, this is at a overall national level, what happened to the consumption of micronutrients, in this case, iron. And this is not such a cheery story, because we see that over time, the consumption, per capita consumption of micronutrients has been declining in almost all, this is true in almost all states, primarily because rice in particular has displaced the consumption of these nutritious C4 cereals. And you could see that that decline is particularly sharp in the rural poor, the lowest income strata, which is the population that we are talking about in this landscape in the heart of India. So you could see very much why this happened, because there is the public distribution system in India, which is an amazing, for the biggest food security program in the world, I'm sure, which distributes cereals and kerosene and a couple of other things, sugar, to below poverty income households at a highly, highly subsidized rate. This is one PDS distribution center. And what has been distributed in these through this public distribution center has been rice primarily, and wheat as well, and not the traditional cereals. That has been recently changing in some states. So you can see how, as people become more, go to these public distribution centers for their cereals, and these are the places that are distributing rice for a very subsidized rate, you could see how the diets have changed and how that per capita consumption of iron would have gone down, because no longer are those traditional cereals consumed at the same amount, and there has not been subsequent changes in the diet that would compensate for the loss of those micronutrients. So what does that mean about climate resilience? Getting back to the climate resilience story, this is work from a postdoc, Kyle Davis, who looked at the yields of these different cereals in terms of their sensitivity to an extreme dry year and an extreme hot year. So if you're seeing a negative here, that means the yields were lower in an extreme year. And this is a comparison of rice, which is the orangish color, compared to the millet and sorghum in the same places where those are grown. So trying to compare the same kinds of places, because there's variability of climate. So what we see here is that the rice, compared to finger millet, maize, pearl millet, and sorghum, takes a bigger hit on an extreme dry year than these C4 cereals, which is exactly what you'd expect from their physiology being a C4 plants. Same true to a little bit of a lesser extent in an extreme hot year. So there is some benefit for climate resilience, for yields not suffering so badly in extreme years by growing or returning to these traditional cereals. From a climate mitigation point of view, that's really a pretty clear story that when you add up, this is work by a colleague, Narasimha Rao, who's now at Yale. And if you add up all of the emission sources from fertilizer and N2O use, from machinery, the CO2, and then the methane from paddy rice, you can see here how the methane is really the story here, that the greenhouse gas emissions are much higher for rice than for these other cereals. So we did an exercise, which I won't drag you into the details of this exercise, but we asked, what if, this is purely a thought experiment, what if there was these traditional cereals grown in the places where they historically have been grown, because there's a lot of cultural aspects to this question as well, where they've historically been grown without increasing more cropped area, because there isn't more cropped area to move into, and keeping total production constant in terms of tons. How would it change the production of nutrients, protein, iron, other zinc, other kinds of nutrients? How would it change the demand for irrigation? How would it change the demand for energy? How would it change the greenhouse gas emissions? And how would it change the climate resilience? So the dotted line in these circles is the current, and the wheels here are the different dimensions for what happens to all of these different sort of objective functions under the scenario where, under two different scenarios of increasing the production of the traditional cereals. And what we see here is that it's basically mostly a win-win story, that if with some increased production of those C4 traditional cereals in places, strategically in places where it makes sense to grow them, that there could be some real substantial win-wins for nutrition, for reducing greenhouse gases, for reducing water demand, and for climate resilience without increasing crop area or having overall production decline. So that is a story that has really been taken on, not because of our studies, we just added to it, but it's been a big conversation in India about, and even the government has now declared these cereals as nutri-cereals. And what I take from this story is that, again, start from what people need, start from really the nutrition need and the seriousness of iron deficiency in particular, that efforts to improve nutrition for local populations, such as those in central India, can enhance climate resilience, so that's a win, and can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so that's a win also. But starting from the point of view of what people need, because trying to introduce climate resilience strategies or reduction in greenhouse gas emission strategies which don't go along with what people need, then also it's not likely to be successful. So what's going on now, and there's probably some people in the audience who are well aware of this, is that these millets and traditional cereals have become really trendy. You can go into high-end restaurants and fancy grocery stores and find them nicely packaged, a little expensive, but people are really seeing the value of these cereals. People, urban population in general, who see the value for nutrition and all the other reasons. And then in the public distribution system, there are some states, not the state yet where this picture was taken, but in some states that have started to include those traditional cereals in the distribution. So there's some real potential here, and it's changed drastically in the last couple of years. Again, as I can say, not necessarily related to our study, but a lot of people who have been working on this, and these cereals, which used to be considered, coarse cereals and inferior, are now getting more popular. So that's my second story. So we could stop there.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here from Javed. Is there nutrition household income trade-off in shifting from cereal-centric to nutri-cereals focused?
Well, that's a good question, because these I'm going to call them nutri-cereals. These, which you did, Javed, these nutri-cereals, they get a good price now for farmers because there's demand. So, so the question is, who is actually eating these cereals? Are these the people who could really benefit from them, who are food insecure and have very non-diverse cereal-heavy diets, or is it the urban elite, which probably has a pretty decent diet to start with? So it's great that farmers get income from growing these cereals, and it would be really great if they could increase their income and also consume these cereals themselves. But I don't know how that is actually playing out on the ground. Maybe somebody in the audience knows more.
A question from Ryan: what are the setbacks in switching to C4 crops? What have the setbacks been?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because if the obvious question is, if they're so wonderful and there's so many advantages, why don't people just switch? And there is a whole You know, there's a whole rice industry and a whole wheat industry, and the whole public distribution system as it's been developed by the government has been around procuring rice and storage for rice and distribution of rice. And there's a big, lobby for these crops as well. So, so like anything, I could say, it's kind of a lock-in situation where a switch would be, the obstacles are that there's a whole industry that's created around the other cereals, which also have their place. I'm not saying people shouldn't eat rice or switch completely to these nutri-cereals, but they could have some real benefits for people's diets.
Okay, a question from Eden. Is there any worry that the trendiness of C4 grains among wealthier people could actually lead to higher prices?
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly that. So Javed, and I see added in there that the MSP, the support price that the government guarantees is also an issue, because people grow the rice because they know it's going to get a guaranteed price. They know the government's going to procure it. So that's a big issue for the switch. So sorry, Peter, can you remind me again what that last question was?
Yeah, I think it was, is the demand from wealthier people raising the prices, increasing the prices.
Yes, yes, yes. I think from the farmer's point of view, if they can sell these cereals, then that's good for them, because they have a higher income, and they could use that to purchase a more diverse diet or build a durable house. But then the question is, is it affordable? I could say the prices are high. At least I am biased by my particular study region, where I know that when you talk to people about why they don't eat these cereals, they'll say things like, "Oh, my grandfather used to eat this," or my cousin grows this, or all these things. But then they'll say, "But they're expensive." It's not that, yeah, they're expensive. And there's also another issue about the processing, that there's a different kind of processing that's required because they have a hard husk.
Okay, thanks, sir. Lots of good questions. I'm going to go back just a little bit, and then maybe we should move on. So I think the last question for this section would be from Maddie. How did you form the relationships or make the connections with locals in order to have those people on the ground to truly determine what the needs of the people are?
Oh, well, I can't say I fully understand the needs of the people, but I can say that just been there and have students be there, and we've done a lot of surveys and listened to what people say. And I think, and I will never ever say that I fully understand the people and the landscape, but I understand it a lot more than I did, say, 10 or 15 years ago, and just spend time there.
Great, thanks. So maybe we should move on to your third story, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some additional questions.
Okay. This third story, if I can get the slide to go, yeah, relates to, and this is a very short story, relates to the migration. So, we found from our surveys of the 5,000 households that migration is seasonal and is a livelihood strategy that the poorest adopt. So this is not, I'm sure there are cases of this. I know there are cases of this, but this is not migration to study or to, get a really good job, or this is more out of need. Not really aspirational, but more need-based, you could say, desperation. Migration, and we saw that with the COVID situation, when the migrants who were stuck in the cities when the lockdown came, and it was just the most tragic just a huge human tragedy that that they couldn't get back to neither could they get back to their villages, nor could they support themselves in the cities because they lost their jobs and they're living day to day. So such a horrible, tragic situation, which I'm sure many of you saw in the news. So, so the question here is, what's the relationship between migration and extreme climate? Because as we saw before, we can expect to see more extreme climate in this landscape. And we hear a lot the narrative that the most vulnerable, the poorest, are the most sensitive to climate change, and we hear a lot about this climate forced migration as being one of the big impacts of climate change, increasing migration because people can't survive on their land when there's a climate shock. So this is the question we set out to ask in this landscape. Is that actually true? And again, using those 5,000 households that we surveyed in 500 villages, this is what you're seeing here. The redder and bigger the dot, the higher the proportion of households in a village. In a village, a higher proportion of households have migrants, rely on a migration strategy. So is this related to climate, and how might we expect that climate might change this trajectory in the future? The goal here is that migration is not, like other things, not all good or all bad, but the goal would be for migration to be a choice rather than a necessity. So we know that going back to 1980, based on what people say, so this is all based on what people say, that the number of households with migrants, with seasonal migrants, so they'll go for part of the year and come back for part of the year, has increased over the years, which you would certainly expect with the increase in economy, the demand for construction or expansion of urban areas. So that's not surprising at all. I'm showing you here some pictures. I just grabbed these off of the of newspaper articles about the COVID lockdown situation and the horrible situation of these migrants trying, walking, trying to get rides any way they could to get back to their villages. And that happened in this landscape as well as many other places. So the question that we asked here, my student Pooja Choksi asked here, was that, is there a relationship between households that decide for the first time that somebody in their household needs to migrate to supplement the income and climate extremes? And what we found was a bit surprising, and not really the narrative that that we might think, is that the poorest are the ones that are most vulnerable to climate shocks in terms of migration. So I'm sorry, the axes labels here are probably way too small than you can see, but the x-axis is the variability in maximum temperature. So so how much the sort of the z-score of maximum temperature. So if it's negative, that means it's hotter than normal, and positive, it's colder than normal. And on the y-axis is the probability, this is at a household unit, the probability of a household having a migrant for the first time, deciding that year that they need to send a migrant to the cities. And what we see here is really not the narrative that the poorest are the most sensitive to a climate shock, that those households in poorer districts have a pretty flat line here. First of all, higher, so they have more proportion of households which have migrants overall. We know that, but they are actually less sensitive to climate variability than better off households. Now that's a relative term. to less poor households, according to the multidimensional poverty index at a district level. So that's a little different than what we normally think, that the poorest are going to be the ones that are going to have to start migrating. I interpret this to mean that the poorest households are just poor regardless of whether it's a hot year, a dry year, a wet year, a cold year. No matter what, they rely on migration to supplement their income, whereas the less poor, which are probably likely to have more land and get more income from agriculture, are the ones that are more sensitive to extreme climate years. So what does that mean in thinking about the kinds of climate adaptation strategies? We often think in landscapes like this that adaptation strategies relate to agriculture and climate resilience and introducing climate resilient crops like the millets. But from these results suggest that the poorest households would not really benefit from that because they're migrating regardless. So what I take from this story is that that climate adaptation related to agriculture benefits less poor households, while the poorest are likely to continue to migrate to the cities. So if the goal is to provide more options to households so that they are not obligated to send migrants to the cities, it can be aspirational migration, but not be obligated, then climate adaptation for agriculture might benefit them less than it would other households who are less likely to migrate in the first instance, but would be more sensitive to extreme years. So that's the third story. So I guess I'll just finish here and then we can open it up for the rest of the time. And so just going from these sort of GIS, global scale, beautiful maps of potential and thinking about what we being global society needs to do for climate mitigation and climate adaptation and trying to square that with realities on the ground. I come from this has turned around my perspective that climate solutions don't start with our maps. They start with livelihoods and human well-being of people on the ground. And if better livelihoods and better well-being coincides with climate resilience, reducing emissions, then we can get somewhere. So here for me, like where do we think about how to start with thinking about climate solutions? And for me, it's like if you start from the local livelihoods and health and climate resilience, where does that overlap with climate mitigation, which that's the story number one. But then that all has to come together with political will and the ability to implement. So this is a really, really hard problem. And it takes a lot of smart people, a lot smarter than me, to figure out how to bring climate resilience and climate mitigation to many, many places around the world. So really digging into each place, I think, is the perspective that I've taken. And lots of people need to come into this conversation. So this is just a promo for this Network for Conserving Central India, which is a network of many people who care deeply about this landscape, because this landscape, it just kind of grabs you. It's just really an amazing landscape. So please join if that interests you. And I will just finish off here by noting lots of collaborators, wonderful collaborators, and to thank you. And it was really these tigers that got me to this landscape in the first place, but it's the people that really grab you there. So I think I will stop sharing.
Great. So thank you so much. send you our virtual applause. And so you can see there are a number of questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to them all, unfortunately. But let's see, where should we start? How about Manasi has a question. Does social capital influence migration patterns of less poor households?
Yeah, that is a really good question that we are on the cusp of trying to answer. And we want to answer the question of whether, so there were the migrants that returned with the COVID lockdown, and have they gone back to the city, or have they stayed in their villages? So I've heard, just anecdotally, because I'm not there, unfortunately, anecdotally different stories that some migrants who came back really invested in their land, improving their land, growing millets for a good price, and make a good life in the village, so they don't return to the city and to that migration livelihood strategy. And others have returned, and we are just now starting to think about how we can figure that out and find out how many people have returned, how many have stayed, and particularly to your question is, what is the role of social capital, of institutions, like community institutions, in that decision about whether to go back again or to try to make a better life in the village.
Great, thanks. So a question from Kate. When communicating with people who live in this area, do you communicate the broader efforts of climate mitigation, or only emphasize those aspects that will specifically benefit their life?
Yeah, I would never bring up climate mitigation, because I do not, this is my personal thinking, I do not think that climate mitigation should be the responsibility of these people living in this landscape, very poor, just trying to make it through the day. If they can get some benefit from climate mitigation, some carbon money, or some development attention for climate mitigation, and if it helps them, then I think that's great. But I wouldn't try to tell them that hope I don't tell people what they should do, but I don't think I would say that they shouldn't grow rice because they're producing a lot of methane. I would say if they produced millets, they could make some good money and have some good cereals to eat.
Thanks. Question from Alyssa about climate adaptation. If climate adaptation doesn't help the poorest, what can? Who would be responsible for coming up with this solution? That
is the million-dollar question, and that's the whole question of development. And how do you, I don't have a good answer, how do you create a rural economy? I mean, we have this question in this country also. How do you create a good rural economy that provides for livelihoods without people having to, run off to the city, if that's what they want, if they want to stay in their landscapes? I don't have a good answer, but one answer is that to create the industry that would provide more value to the products that they are producing, to be able to sell for high prices, for example, to put those millets in those nice fancy packages instead of sell the raw cereals to somebody else who makes most of the profit off of that, and to perhaps think about more high value agricultural production, because it's really hard to have a decent livelihood off of selling rice, and the yields are extremely low.
Thanks. So a question from Wolfgar. Does the current agricultural protests have an effect on the migrant cycle, and how do you suspect the current protests will have an effect on those poorest peoples?
Oh wow, straight into the politics. So for those, I guess, if most people have been following that news, but there are these protests going on now. There's an encampment of farmers in around the Delhi area to protest the government initiative to take away these support prices and basically reduce the government support and commercialize agriculture, basically. Greta Thunberg has gotten into this and gotten herself in some hot water. So I'm going to try not to get in hot water here. But, you know, that protest is mostly being led, as far as I understand, from farmers from Punjab and Haryana, which is I mean, you could say that's like the analogy of the Midwest here. Those are the high yielding, where most of the production, cereal production, comes from the country. So, but I would imagine if what the government wants to do did go into effect, it would really change the dynamics in this landscape, because the farmers who produce rice, they are depending on that guaranteed price.
Okay, thank you. Question from Nestor, back to the preserves. What's currently being done to help increase the area of the reserves that many species inhabit at the heart of India?
Yeah, okay, so you know, contrary to what it might seem like, India's done a really pretty amazing job with its wildlife, which goes back to Indira Gandhi and the Wildlife Protection Act, relative to other places in Asia. So there are also increasing resources, well, I don't know, increasing, but there are resources that go to the tiger reserves, and there have been some more declared tiger reserves in this landscape. So from the point of view of the protected areas themselves, they get pretty good resources and pretty good management, relatively speaking. The issue is about this connectivity, because these reserves are just so small. It's not like the size of national parks that we think about in this country or in South Africa or in other places. They're really small. And so the issue is, the big conservation issue is not so much within the protected areas, but between them, and ensuring that the connectivity between them remains. And that's where all of these pressures to roads, highways, rails, mines, energy infrastructure, all of these related infrastructure is really the big conservation issue.
Thanks. Question from Stephanie, again about conservation areas. Are livelihood improvement measures in this area connected to conservation outcomes for wildlife?
So you might be referring to the issue of resettlement, of moving people out of the parks, which is people live within, you know, there's still few, but some people living within the parks, and there's been a lot of emphasis, government emphasis, on resettling people out from inside to outside of the parks. And this, again, is an extremely sensitive topic. And that was the topic that one of my PhD students who did the study about food security took on very bravely, because it's such a sensitive topic. So she studied whether those households which were resettled, means they get compensation. There's been not a very good history to resettlement. There has been definitely some injustices in the past of moving people out of the park. Currently, there are some pretty good compensation schemes. So what Amrita did in her study was to, in one particular park, to follow up, find all of those 800 some households, where they went after they had been resettled, and to see how they were doing. And her metric of how they were doing was food security. And what she found was that their well-being was no different than the well-being of the neighbors that they were, you know, the places where they moved, which isn't to say that they're doing fantastically well, but that they're not in, you know, without land, or you know, or there's lots of myths around this about what people do with their compensation. And we found that most people, you know, a lot of people are, you know, sending their kids to school, bought land, which they have to do to get the compensation, and do not have worse food security than their neighbors. So this is, Amrita tried to stay out of the sort of political fray on this one, by just focusing on figuring out what, not comparing how they were when they were in the park to out of the park, because they've already been resettled, but how they are doing once they get resettled.
Thanks. Question from Mariella. Are there sustainable energy forms, solar panels, etc., that are being implemented? Is LPG cheaper? Is that why it's more commonly used?
Yeah, good question. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I know that in India in general, there has been definitely expansion of solar, a big push of the Prime Minister. In this landscape, there are plans for renewable infrastructure for solar and wind, which could benefit people if they get the energy, but it's also another competing use for land, in addition to all those highways and agriculture and conservation and all the other land uses. So, you know, we tend to think that renewable energy is the answer, but really there's a pretty big land footprint of wind and solar, and where's that land going to come from, and what's it going to displace? So I think it's so now. So the LPG is also it's in canisters, so there's not the grid. Even if the energy came from solar, these households would not be on a grid to be able to benefit at this point.
Okay, maybe take one more. And this is a question from Ananya. So it's a question about tigers people. Have tigers in the region killed some of the local inhabitants, possibly leading to further killing of those tigers to protect people?
Yes, thank you. That's another big issue in this landscape, is the human-wildlife conflict. So there are from time to time people that get killed by the tigers. It's not that often, not that often. I always say, you know, I have a higher chance of getting hit by a car on Broadway than of getting attacked by a tiger. But it does happen, And then a bigger issue is that tigers and leopards will predate on livestock. So that's a big loss for households, and the government has compensation schemes around that. But an even bigger impact on farmers that we found years ago, sort of the first work that we did there, was that the crop damage from the ungulates, from the prey, was a bigger problem for farmers than the more charismatic livestock kills and when people get killed. So
thank you so much. We have lots of more questions. I apologize to those of you that we didn't get to all of them, but we're at 4. And Ruth, thank you so much for coming and giving us a very interesting talk.
Okay, well,
on
thank
some
you.
Of the issues.
Thank you very much. It was great to be with you.
And I remind you, Ruth is going to give another talk on Thursday.
It'll be very, very different. That'll be very abstract and sort of global scale, abstract kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.